Inflation is a very serious subject. You can argue it's the way democracies die.
Charlie Munger seems very worried about an upcoming inflation crisis, but what exactly is going to cause this? Let's have a look.
We were in desperate trouble. We were on the eve of a Great Recession that could have been a Great Depression, and then followed by the rise of people like Adolf Hitler and so on and so on.
The real question is, have we seen something like this in the past so that we could maybe prepare for what's coming?
Is it something investors need to be worried about, specifically when it comes to growth stocks right now?
Well, I think the safe assumption for an investor is that over the next 100 years, the currency is going to zero. That's my working hypothesis.
If the dollar is going to become worthless, what is going to be the next global currency?
What brought in Hitler was the combination of the Weimar inflation, where they utterly destroyed the savings of the middle class in Germany, followed by the Great Depression. It was a 1-2 punch. And Hitler came in, crazy demagogue, with 40% of the votes, and pretty soon we had a dictator hell-bent for world war.
Well, some people now say that federal debt is not a problem at all.
Well, if you believe that, you believe in the tooth fairy, because then we don't have to have any more taxes ever. We'll just print money and live happily ever after. It obviously won't work.
So
there comes a point when printing money is counterproductive.
Are we at that point? Are you concerned?
No, I don't think we are at that point.
Most importantly, does the government have something under their sleeves to get us through the recession?
Going back to inflation specifically, though, Charlie, do you think the Federal Reserve is doing the right thing now or not?
In a modern democracy in the age of Keynes, you're going to get big government reaction. The reaction this time was bigger than it's ever been before in the history of the United States. They just threw money at the problem, and they were probably right to fear what was going to happen and to be quite liberal in throwing money at it, but they probably overdid it a little. They threw so much money so fast that it's hard for the restaurants to get people to do the work. But I don't criticize it. It's hard to make these decisions under pressure.
You think there will be a high economic price to pay as the Fed attempts to bring inflation back under control?
We've done something pretty extreme, and we don't know how bad the troubles will be, whether we're going to be like Japan or something a lot worse. What makes life interesting is we don't know how it's going to work out. I think we do know we're flirting with serious trouble. Inflation is a very serious subject. You can argue it's the way democracies die. When democracy dies in Latin America, inflation is a big part of it. So it's a huge danger once you've got a populace that learns it can vote itself money. If you overdo it too much, you ruin your civilization a lot. And so, of course, it's a big, long-range danger. If you look at the Roman Republic, even after they went to an empire with an absolute ruler, they inflated the currency steadily for hundreds of years, and eventually the whole damn Roman Empire collapsed. So it's the biggest long-range danger we have, probably, apart from nuclear war.
What about the lack of volatility that we've seen in the markets? That's also kind of, as central banks got into the game and increased liquidity.
Well, of course, it's with all this massive central bank interference. I think that was necessary to do. In other words, I admire the politicians who did it, and the technocrats, including the Federal Reserve people. And I think it was absolutely required, and that the danger they were avoiding was worse than the troubles they caused. But it was very peculiar, and it did have the accidental effect of bailing out the rich in order to help the poor. And nobody was doing that because they loved the rich. They just didn't have any other tool in the kit, and they had to do something.
So the inequality that came from that...
It wasn't malevolence. And it was an accident, and it probably won't happen again. And it's not a permanent conspiracy against the poor. It was an accident that we had the huge recession, caused partly by massive stupidity in finance and venality. And then when we ran out of tools and had to do something really peculiar that we'd never done before, that was a wise thing to do given the amount of trouble we were in. You got to remember that if the trouble had been allowed to run, we might have had a revisitation of the kind of troubles that brought Hitler into power. So we were facing real difficulties. And both parties and our technocrats got together for the last time, I think, and worked us out of it. So it was a very admirable thing in which you can all be proud. I've been proud of nothing in politics since.
There are all sorts of political proposals out there right now to try and solve that inequality that was created. Everything from a 70% tax on the highest brackets to a wealth tax to taxing stock buybacks or even preventing them. Do you think any of them work?
I don't think they have to destroy some inequality. It's probably going to go away by itself.
Why?
Well, I think we hit a peak of inequality because the authorities had no alternative but to print a lot of money. Of course, that bailed out asset values, but that was a fluke, and they can't really do more of it. They've played that game once as much as they really can, and so I don't think people who are worried about inequality should worry too much about a lot more of it from a lot more interest rate lowering.
Let me shift gears a little bit, Charlie, and ask you about the U.S. economy. And what is your take on where things are right now?
Well, obviously they're booming, but you know, the economy sometimes booms and sometimes it doesn't. And you have to live your life through both episodes. And our attitude is we just keep swimming, and sometimes the tide is with us and sometimes against. But we keep swimming either way.
Are you surprised by how long this expansion has lasted?
Of course, it's lasted a long time. But what was really remarkable is we never printed money so much and spent it so fast and bought back so much debt, public and private. So this is total terra incognita in economics. And nobody knew for sure how it was going to work.
So is it risky then?
Of course it was risky, but it worked. And I don't think they had much else that would work. They weren't set up to do stimulus. Too much controversy, democratic inertias, the various guys. So they had to do something. And all they had left was just to print money and start buying things. And that's what they did. And it turned out to be a very wise response. And what's even more remarkable is that both Congress and the presidency and under both parties made the same decision. They all cooperated. It was the last time.
But where is that going to leave us, ultimately?
Well, it left us licking the Great Recession, so maybe we ought to try cooperation again since it worked so well once.
How much is President Trump responsible for this current economic situation?
Well, I think he deserves some credit, but a lot of it just happened.
Economic cycle?
Yeah. And the decisions of his predecessors.
What do you think about the president's campaign to lobby the Fed to lower rates or keep rates low?
Well, I think presidents have always done this. If you're a politician, democracy, of course, you want people to print money and spend it. And, of course, it's not a good idea. The best example, probably in the whole world, is Singapore, which has zero debt and never prints money and spends it, and is one of the most successful places on earth. I wish we were like that, but there's only one Singapore.
Well, some people now say that federal debt is not a problem at all.
Well, if you believe that, you believe in the tooth fairy, because then we don't have to have any more taxes ever. We'll just print money and live happily ever after. It obviously won't work.
So
there comes a point when printing money is counterproductive.
Are we at that point? Are you concerned?
No, I don't think we are at that point, but nobody knew where the point was going to come, and we don't know now. None of these people who are so pompously sure of things, because we all want reassurance, and so they provide it. But nobody really knows how much of this is too much.
And do you have any thoughts on Jay Powell and the job that he's done?
I think he's as good a choice as we could have made.
One consequence of this expansion, or actually it precedes that, it's just something that's occurred in our economy over the past 50 years really, has been wealth and income inequality.
Yeah.
One, do you see it as a problem? Two, if so, how do we address it?
Well, it's a problem if enough politicians are screaming about it. That makes it a problem. If it weren't for that, this one will go away by itself. It happened by accident. We were in desperate trouble. We were on the eve of a Great Recession that could have been a Great Depression, and then followed by the rise of people like Adolf Hitler and so on and so on. So we faced a real catastrophe. The only weapon they had was to print money and spend it. And they did it. And they drove interest rates down to zero, or real interest rates. Well, of course, that lifted asset values for the people who were already rich. Nobody was trying to make the rich richer. It just was an accidental byproduct of a correct governmental decision made on a bipartisan basis. And since it was a weird byproduct that occurred in a weird time, it will go away by itself in due course.
It'll go away by itself,
Sure.
So there's no reason for...
The people that are screaming about it are idiots. It's going to go away by itself. Now, that's not to say that we can't raise the minimum wage a little and enlarge the social safety net a little. We should be doing that as we prosper. Both parties agree on that.
What are your current thoughts on the inflationary environment? And please compare and contrast it to the 1970s.
When Volcker, after the 70s, took the prime rate to 20% and the government was paying 15% on its government bonds, that was a horrible recession. Lasted a long time, caused a lot of agony. And I certainly hope we're not going there again. I think the conditions that allowed Volcker to do that without an interference from the politicians were very unusual. 2020 hindsight, it was a good thing that he did it. I would not predict that our modern politicians will be as willing to permit a new Volcker to get that tough with the economy and bring on that kind of a recession. So I think the new troubles are likely to be different from the old troubles. The troubles that come to us could be worse than what Volcker was dealing with, and harder to fix.
Like what?
Think of all the Latin American countries that print too much money. They get strongmen and so forth. That's what Plato said happened in the early Greek city-state democracies. One person, one vote, a lot of equality, and you get demagogues, and the demagogues lather up the population, and pretty soon you don't have your democracy anymore. I don't think that was a crazy idea on Plato's part. I think that accurately described what happened in Greece way back then, and it's happened again and again and again in Latin America. We don't want to go there. At least I don't.
Conventional economic theory argues that excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus over the last 2 years has triggered the highest inflation in 40 years. Do you broadly agree with this thesis? And more importantly, do you think there will be a high economic price to pay as the Fed attempts to bring inflation back under control?
We've done something pretty extreme, and we don't know how bad the troubles will be, whether we're going to be like Japan or something a lot worse. What makes life interesting is we don't know how it's going to work out. I think we do know we're flirting with serious trouble. I think we also know that some of our earlier fears were overblown. Japan is still existing as a civilized nation, in spite of unbelievable excess by all former standards in terms of money printing. Think of how seductive it is. You have a bunch of interest-bearing debts, and you pay them off with checking accounts, which you're no longer paying interest. Think of how seductive that is for a bunch of legislators. You get rid of the interest payments and the money supply goes up. It seems like heaven. And of course, when things get that seductive, they're likely to be overused.
Do you think it's likely that we will experience a major increase in interest rates in the upcoming decades, like, for example, in the period between 1950 and 1980?
Well, that, of course, is a very intelligent question and a very difficult question. When you print money on the scale that modern nations are printing it, Japan, the United States, Europe, etc., we're getting into new territory in terms of size. The Japanese bought back not only a lot of their own debt, but a lot of their common stocks. So the Federal Reserve System, you can't imagine how much money printing Japan has done. They haven't had all that much inflation, and it's still a very admirable civilization. Japan is one of the more admirable civilizations in the whole world. And in spite of all this very extreme government money printing they've done, and they haven't had terrible consequences. Now they've had 25 years of stasis with living standards not improving very much. I don't think that came from their macroeconomic policies. I think that came from the rise of tough competition for their export powerhouse from China and Korea. It's weird what's happening, and nobody knows for sure how it's going to work out. I think it's encouraging that Japan can print as much money as it has and remain as civilized and calm and admirable as it has. And so I hope to God the United States has a similar happy outcome. There's never been anything quite like what we're doing now, and we do know from what's happened in other nations, if you try and print too much money, it eventually causes terrible trouble. And we are closer to terrible trouble than we've been in the past, but it may still be a long way off. I certainly hope so.